Welcome back, guys. So many of you messaged me asking about the questions and topics from the June 2025 UGC NET English exam. As always, we've got your back. We've collected everything directly from our students based on their memory. Now, as you know, we don't get the question paper after the exam. So we might not be able to get the exact questions word for word, but what we do have are the exact topics that were asked. And wherever possible, we'll try forming those questions too. Now, just like always, before diving into the questions, we break them down into 8 simple sections. This helps us stay organized and focused as we move ahead. So the sections are British literature with around 25 questions, Indian writing in English with about 15 questions, literary criticism, theory and culture covering nearly 30 questions, world literature including American, Australian, Canadian and others making up 5 questions, language and linguistics around 10 questions, research aptitude as always with 5 questions, and reading comprehension with the usual 10 questions. Let's begin right away with British literature. This is where we start. Alright, let's begin with British literature. One of the questions focused on Geoffrey Chaucer's lesser studied works. These include The Legend of Good Women, Troilus and Cresside, The Book of the Duchess, The House of Fame, and Anilida and Arcite. These early poems blend themes of courtly love, dream visions, and classical references. They explore ideas like loyalty, grief, and poetic inspiration, all beyond the fame of the Canterbury Tales. Now coming to Shakespeare, the exam mentioned The Rape of Lucrece, published in 1594, along with Troilus and Cressida, and The Phoenix and the Turtle, which appeared in 1601. There was also a question on the line Under the Greenwood Tree, taken from the pastoral setting of As You Like It. Moving on, another interesting question came from the essay On the Knocking at the Gate in Macbeth by Thomas de Quincey. In this piece, De Quincey reflects on how the sound of knocking after King Duncan's murder heightens the horror by pulling us back into the real world, away from the supernatural dread. The question simply asked who wrote this essay. Finally, there was a poetic line, My babe, so beautiful, it thrills my heart with tender gladness, thus to look at thee. Students were asked who said this. The line is from Frost at Midnight, written in 1798 by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. In this passage, Coleridge is speaking to his infant son Hartley, expressing his hope that the child will grow up surrounded by nature, unlike the poet himself, who spent his early life confined in the city and schoolrooms. Another similar question was on Charles Lamb and his friendship with Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The two first met as schoolboys at Christ's Hospital School in London and remained close throughout their lives. Charles Lamb is best known for Essays of Elia, published in 1823, and Tales from Shakespeare, written in 1807 along with his sister Mary Lamb. His essays, often featured in the London Magazine, were widely appreciated, especially among literary circles and the middle-class readers of the time. There were also several questions on famous subtitles. For example, Frankenstein or The Modern Prometheus, Middlemarch, a study of provincial life by George Eliot, published between 1871 and 1872, and Oliver Twist, or The Parish Boy's Progress by Charles Dickens. Another was The Traveller, or A Prospect of Society, a philosophical poem by Oliver Goldsmith that reflects on the nature of happiness across different nations and cultures. One direct question asked how many parts Middlemarch was originally published in. The answer is 8. It was first released in serial form between 1871 and 1872. There was also a terminology-based question on the word Erziehungsroman. This German literary term means a novel of education or upbringing. It usually follows a young protagonist's moral, intellectual, and psychological development, tracing how life experiences help shape their identity and character over time. Another question tested our knowledge of literary settings, specifically from Rudyard Kipling's short story Mrs. Bathurst. The primary setting of the story is in South Africa, near Cape Town, especially around Simon's Bay, which was known as a naval base. The narrative also includes recollections of places like New Zealand and London. Moving on to poetry, there was a question on W.B. Yeats' works. 4 groups of poems were given, and we had to choose the correct combination. The right set included The Second Coming, written in 1919, Sailing to Byzantium from 1928, and Leda and the Swan, published in 1924. The exam also featured a question on Joseph Conrad's Tales of Unrest, published in 1898. This is a collection of intense and psychologically layered short stories. Some of the stories mentioned were An Outpost of Progress and The Lagoon. Lastly, Henry James appeared again with 2 of his important works. Two Magics, published in 1898, features the famous ghost story The Turn of the Screw. And The Spoils of Poynton, released in 1897, is a novel that explores the tension between aesthetic passion, moral dilemmas, and the emotional value we attach to objects. There was a question on a couple of characters from the novels of D.H. Lawrence. His works are filled with emotionally intense and often conflicted relationships. In Sons and Lovers, we see Paul Morrell and Miriam Levers share a tender but strained connection, largely overshadowed by Paul's strong attachment to his mother. In The Rainbow, Ursula Brangwyn and Anton Skrybensky's relationship eventually breaks apart as Ursula yearns for deeper emotional and intellectual freedom. In Women in Love, Ursula later finds a more fulfilling, though still complicated partner in Birkin. Meanwhile, her sister Gudrun gets entangled in a volatile and destructive affair with Gerald Critch. And of course, the most iconic pairing comes from Lady Chatterley's Lover, where Constance, or Lady Chatterley, and Oliver Mellers challenge the norms of class and intimacy through a deeply physical and emotional bond. There was also a question about the Georgian poets. This group included names like Rupert Brooke, Walter de la Mare, W.H. Davies, John Drinkwater, Wilfred Wilson Gibson, Harold Monroe, and even early works by D.H. Lawrence and Robert Graves. Edited by Edward Marsh, these poets were known for their lyrical and pastoral style. Their works were collected in the Georgian Poetry Anthologies published between 1912 and 1922. Another question focused on Dylan Thomas and his poem in October, written in 1944. It's one of his most personal and reflective pieces, capturing a birthday walk filled with memory and nature. And finally, there was a set of questions on Philip Larkin. His poems, like Days, The Old Fools, Going, Talking in Bed, and Wild Oats, all revolve around themes like aging, loneliness, missed connections, and the quiet ache of love and disappointment. His style is deceptively simple yet emotionally deep. That's all the questions we could gather so far from British literature. Now let's move on to the next section, which is literary criticism, theory, and culture. As you might have noticed, the number of questions from this section has gone up this time. Around 30 questions were asked compared to the usual 25. We've gathered these topics directly from students, and now I'm going to walk you through what we found. So let's begin. Let's start with a classic from Aristotle. In Poetics, Book 6, he outlines 6 key elements of tragedy ranked in order of importance. First comes plot, which he calls the soul of tragedy, since it drives the action and stirs emotions like pity and fear. Then comes character, reflecting the moral intentions of the figures on stage. Thought is next, referring to the ideas and reasoning behind the actions. Diction is the language and style used. Melody refers to the musical elements, especially in the chorus. And finally, spectacle is the visual display. Aristotle considers spectacle the least important because it pleases the senses but doesn't engage the mind. Moving on, there was a question on John Dryden's Essay of Dramatic Poesy, published in 1668. In this work, Dryden famously compares Shakespeare and Ben Jonson to classical poets. He says, Shakespeare was the Homer, or father of our dramatic poets. Jonson was the Virgil, the pattern of elaborate writing. With this, Dryden highlights Shakespeare's natural genius and epic imagination, much like Homer, while admiring Johnson's polished and scholarly style, similar to Virgil. Now, a couple of direct questions on key feminist texts. One asked, who wrote The Subjection of Women? The answer is John Stuart Mill. He published it in 1869, arguing that the social and legal inequality of women was outdated and should be replaced by equal rights and individual freedom. And another question was on A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, written by Mary Wollstonecraft in 1792. She strongly advocated for women's education and equality, stating that women, as rational beings, deserve the same rights and opportunities as men. Let's continue with more questions from literary criticism and theory. One of the topics was Matthew Arnold's essay, The Function of Criticism at the Present Time, written in 1865. In this essay, Arnold argues that criticism should be objective and free from personal bias. He believed its role is to spread what he called the best that is known and thought in the world. For Arnold, criticism comes before creation. It helps elevate culture and encourages society to rise above narrow or partisan thinking. Now, there was a question about who introduced the concepts of discourse and panopticism. The answer is Michel Foucault. He defined discourse as the system of knowledge, language, and rules that determine what can be said and thought in any historical period. Panopticism, another idea by Foucault, is a model of modern surveillance where people internalize control and begin to monitor their own behavior, just like being watched in a prison with a central tower. Another question asked who wrote The History of Sexuality. That was also Michel Foucault. It's a multi-volume work where he explains that sexuality is not just repressed by society, but actually shaped and constructed through systems of power and discourse. There was also a question about who coined the terms logocentrism and phonocentrism. These ideas were introduced by Jacques Derrida. He used them to challenge Western philosophy's deep-rooted preference for speech over writing. Logocentrism is the belief that spoken language gives direct access to truth and meaning. Phonocentrism is the assumption that speech is more authentic than writing. Derrida deconstructed these ideas by showing how writing also carries meaning, but it reveals that meaning is always shifting and never fully fixed. Let's move into some key feminist thinkers and theorists. One of the questions traced the timeline of major feminist texts. It all begins with Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, published in 1949, which laid the philosophical groundwork for modern feminism. Then came Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique in 1963, a book that sparked second-wave feminism in the United States by addressing what she called the problem that has no name, the quiet dissatisfaction felt by many suburban housewives. In 1970, two influential books followed, Kate Millett's Sexual Politics and Germaine Greer's The Female Eunuch. Both works question the ways literature and society are shaped by patriarchy. Millett examined male dominance in literature, while Greer argued that traditional female roles repressed women's sexuality and independence. Elaine Showalter's A Literature of Their Own, published in 1977, mapped the evolution of women's writing across three stages. Then, in 1979, Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar wrote The Mad Woman in the Attic, a powerful study of 19th century women writers and the hidden female voices in their texts. Later came Judith Butler, whose Gender Trouble in 1990 introduced the concept of gender performativity, the idea that gender is not something we are, but something we do. She extended this critique in Bodies That Matter, published in 1993, where she explored how even the body itself is shaped by social discourse. There was also a terminology question: who coined deterritorialization and ontotheology? The term deterritorialization was introduced by Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari. It refers to the process where meanings or identities are uprooted from their traditional contexts, especially during cultural or psychological shifts. Ontotheology, on the other hand, was coined by Martin Heidegger. He used it to critique Western metaphysics for reducing the idea of being to just a supreme being or first cause, merging theology with ontology. There was a question on Claude Levy, Strauss's idea of the bricoler. In his theory, a bricoler is someone who creates meaning using whatever materials are at hand. This figure represents mythical thinking where cultural elements are not invented from scratch but creatively reused and reshaped from what already exists. It's about making sense of the world by working with the tools and symbols already available. Then came a question about three important terms: carnivalesque, dialogism, and chronotope. All of these were introduced by Mikhail Bakhtin. He used carnivalesque to describe the rebellious, liberating energy in literature that flips social hierarchies upside down. Dialogism is the idea that meaning is never fixed but always shaped through interaction between multiple voices and perspectives. And chronotope refers to how time and space come together to structure narrative, how the when and where of a story shape its meaning. Another question was based on Stanley Fish's Surprised by Sin. In this influential work, Fish argues that Paradise Lost by John Milton is designed to pull readers into the same experience as Adam and Eve. Through the lens of reader response criticism, he shows how Milton makes us feel the temptation and the fall for ourselves. In this way, reading becomes an act of self-reflection, revealing our own vulnerabilities and moral choices as we move through the poem. Let's look at a few more important concepts from literary theory and cultural studies. There was a question based on this idea: the mental frameworks, the languages, concepts, categories, imagery of thought, and representations which different classes and social groups use to make sense of how society works. This line of thought is often associated with Stuart Hall, who emphasized that ideology is central to cultural studies. According to him, the way we interpret the world is shaped by the cultural and ideological tools available to us. Another question mentioned Giorgio Agamben and the concept of the remainder, especially in his book Homo Caesar, Sovereign Power and Bare Life, published in 1995. Agamben talks about how political power creates a kind of leftover or bare life, human life, that is excluded from legal and political systems, yet is essential for those systems to function. It's a deep and powerful critique of how authority operates. Then we had questions on William Empson, who is best known for pioneering close reading in literary criticism. His works include 7 Types of Ambiguity from 1930, some versions of Pastoral from 1935, and The Structure of Complex Words, published in 1951. These works laid the foundation for analyzing how language creates layered meaning. John Crowe Ransom was also mentioned, a major figure in the New Criticism movement. His key works include The New Criticism, written in 1941, God Without Thunder from 1930, and a poetry collection called Poems About God, first published in 1919. He emphasized the importance of structure, irony, and tension in poetry. Finally, there was a question on who developed formalism in literary theory. The answer is the Russian formalists, think Viktor Shklovsky, Roman Jakobson, and Boris Eichenbaum. In the early 20th century, they focused on the form, structure, and what they called the literariness of a text. They believed that literature should be studied for how it is made, not just what it says or who wrote it. Now let's move to another major section, Indian writing in English. And this time, there was a surprising change. Earlier, this section usually had more than 20 questions. But in the June 2025 exam, the number dropped to just 15. Let's begin with one of the first questions. How many hymns are there in the Rig Veda? The Rig Veda contains 1028 hymns, also known as suktas. These are organized into 10 books or mandalas. Composed in Vedic Sanskrit, the hymns are dedicated to deities like Agni, Indra, Varuna, and Soma. These verses form the spiritual and philosophical core of early Indian thought. Another question touched on a fascinating historical experiment. In India, Emperor Akbar is said to have conducted a language experiment by raising children in complete silence, hoping to discover the so-called natural human language. But the result was that the children did not speak at all. This showed that language doesn't emerge naturally in isolation. It develops only through social interaction and communication. In a question on colonial language debates, students were asked who in the 19th century strongly opposed English as the government language. The answer is Mahatma Jyotirao Phule. He was one of the earliest voices advocating for the promotion of Indian languages and education for the marginalized, challenging the dominance of English in governance and education. There was also a question on Charles Grant, who played a crucial role in pushing for English education in India even before Macaulay. In 1792, he wrote a key document titled Observations on the State of Society Among the Asiatic Subjects of Great Britain, which was later published in 1797. Grant argued for the moral and cultural benefits of English education in India, setting the stage for future colonial policies. Let's continue with some foundational milestones in the history of English education in India. One of the questions was on Minute on Indian Education, written in 1835 by Thomas Babington Macaulay. In this influential document, Macaulay argued that English should be the medium of instruction in India. He claimed that English was a superior language and believed it would help create a class of people who could act as interpreters between the British rulers and the millions they governed. But before Macaulay, the first major proposal actually came from Charles Grant. In 1792, he prepared a report published in 1797 that advocated for English education and the introduction of Christian moral instruction. This report set the tone for later colonial educational policies. After Macaulay's Minute, another important step was Wood's Dispatch of 1854. Often called the Magna Carta of English education in India, this dispatch laid out a formal structure for the Indian education system. Then came the Hunter Commission in 1882, also known as the Indian Education Commission. This focused more on promoting primary and vernacular education. In the early 20th century, the Sadler Commission, which worked between 1917 and 1919, addressed reforms in higher education and university administration. Later, the Sargent Report of 1944 proposed free and compulsory education for all children between the ages of 6 and 14. After independence, the Radhakrishnan Commission of 1948 to 49 emphasized improving university education and the professional quality of teachers. And finally, the Kothari Commission, which operated from 1964 to 1966, introduced the 10 plus 2 plus 3 education structure and recommended the three-language formula, shaping the future of Indian education policy. Now, let's look at some key works and authors from Indian writing in English. One of the questions focused on Two Leaves and a Bud by Malk Raj Anand, published in 1937. This novel exposed the harsh realities of colonial exploitation on tea plantations. It was followed by Anand's Sword and Sickle in 1942, a politically charged novel that delves into Marxist ideas and peasant revolts. Then came A Bend in the Ganges by Manohar Malgonkar, published in 1964. Set during the time of India's partition, it explores the tension between non-violence and revolutionary nationalism. Earlier, in 1955, R.K. Narayan gave us Waiting for the Mahatma, blending humor and idealism to portray the freedom movement through his signature style. In 1960, Raja Rao's The Serpent and the Rope was published. It offers a deeply philosophical take on identity, tradition, and spiritual self-search. Later, in 1979, V.S. Naipaul's A Bend in the River turned the focus to post-colonial Africa, telling the story of political unrest through the eyes of an Indian trader. Another important novel was Funny Boy by Shyam Selvadurai, published in 1994. It's a moving coming-of-age story set in Sri Lanka, exploring themes of ethnicity, sexuality, and the civil conflict between Tamils and Sinhalese. There was also a straightforward question: who wrote Gora and Nalini? The answer is Rabindranath Tagore. Both novels explore complex themes like identity, nationalism, and personal freedom through different stages of India's cultural awakening. Lastly, we had a question about Nissim Ezekiel. Born in 1924 in Bombay, He earned his master's degree in English literature in 1947 and later studied philosophy at Birkbeck College in London. After returning to India in 1952, he published his first poetry collection, A Time to Change, marking the beginning of modern Indian English poetry. He worked as assistant editor at the Illustrated Weekly of India from 1954 to 1959 and later edited the magazine Quest from 1960 to 1966. He also taught at Khalsa College and headed the English department at Mithibai College. Some of his major poetry collections include The Unfinished Man from 1965 and Hymns in Darkness from 1976. In 1983, he received the Sahitya Akademi Award for Latter-day Psalms. He passed away in 2004, remembered as a pioneer of Indian English verse. Let's look at a couple of important plays from Indian writing in English. One question asked, who wrote Hayavadana? The answer is Girish Karnad. He wrote this play in 1971, blending Indian mythology with folk theatre traditions. Through the story of Devadatta, Kapila and Padmini and a parallel subplot about a horse-headed man in search of wholeness, Karnad explores deep questions about identity. Is identity rooted in the mind or in the body? Using traditional performance forms like Yakshagana and the Bhagavata, Karnad brings modern existential themes to life in a uniquely Indian style. Another question was, who wrote The Flute of Krishna? That was Krishna Swami Nagarajan. This play delves into devotion, creativity and spiritual transformation, all centered around the symbolic power of Lord Krishna's flute. It's a gentle yet profound exploration of how divine music can awaken something deeper in human hearts. Now let's shift our focus to the language and linguistics section. And this time, the surprise was real. More than 10 questions were asked from this area, which definitely caught many aspirants off guard. So let's break down what was actually asked. First, there were a few concept-based questions. One was on pidgin. A pidgin is a simplified contact language that develops between speakers of different native tongues. It's mainly used for trade or basic communication and has limited grammar and vocabulary. Then came Creole. A Creole is what happens when a pidgin becomes stable and evolves into a full language. It's passed on to children and becomes the native language of a community. Next was register. This refers to a variation in language based on context or purpose. For example, we speak differently in a formal setting, in casual conversation, or when using technical language. Each of these is a different register. Another term they asked about was dialect. A dialect is a regional or social variety of a language. It includes differences in pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar, and often reflects the cultural or geographical background of the speaker. There was also a question, who coined the term generative grammar? The answer is Noam Chomsky. He introduced this idea to describe a set of rules capable of generating all grammatically correct sentences in a language. This revealed the deep structure behind our linguistic ability. And what else did Chomsky do? Quite a lot. Beyond generative grammar, Chomsky proposed the theory of universal grammar, suggesting that all human languages share a common structure hardwired into the brain. He also developed the Chomsky hierarchy in formal language theory. Outside of linguistics, he became a powerful voice in political thought, known for his critiques of United States foreign policy, media manipulation as seen in his book Manufacturing Consent, and the influence of corporate power in modern democracies. Let's continue with a few more important concepts from the language and linguistics section. One question was on metonymy, a figure of speech where something is referred to by the name of something closely associated with it. For example, using the crown to refer to the monarchy. Then came kenning, which is a metaphorical compound word or phrase found in Old English and Norse poetry. A classic example is Whale Road, which means the sea. These poetic devices add richness and imagery to ancient verse. Next, there was a basic definition type question on sociolinguistics. This is the study of how language interacts with society. It looks at how factors like region, class, gender, and context influence the way people speak and understand language. There was also psycholinguistics, the study of how language is processed in the mind. This includes how we acquire language, how we understand it, and how we produce it in real time. Now, let's address a few myth versus truth questions that were asked. One myth was that second language learners can acquire a new language quickly and easily. But the truth is, language learning takes time, consistent effort, and regular exposure. There are no shortcuts to fluency. Another myth was that only children can achieve native-like fluency. But actually, adults can become fluent too. While they might retain a slight accent or rely more on conscious strategies, it's absolutely possible with enough dedication. And finally, what is second language acquisition? It's the process by which someone learns a language other than their native one. This can happen through formal classroom instruction or through real-life interaction in natural settings. There were a few more questions from this section, but students haven't been able to recall them yet. As soon as we receive more updates, I'll redo this part of the video and upload a revised version. Now let's turn our focus to the research section. As usual, we saw 5 questions from this area. So let's go through what was asked. The first question was on the steps to find a research problem. Here's how you go about it. Step 1. Identify your area of interest. Choose a broad field you're genuinely passionate about, like education, literature, or the environment. Step 2. Conduct a literature review. Dive into journals, books, and recent studies to understand what's already been explored. Step 3. Find gaps or unresolved issues. Look for limitations, contradictions, or areas that haven't been studied deeply. Step 4. Define a specific topic. Narrow your focus to something more manageable that matches your interest and resources. Step 5. Ask research questions. Create clear, focused, and researchable questions to guide your study. Step 6. Assess feasibility. Think about how much time you have, the tools and data available, and your own experience before committing to the topic. And finally, Step 7. Refine and finalize your problem statement. Clearly express the purpose, scope, and importance of your topic in just 1 or 2 sharp sentences. Now, the second question was on MLA formatting, specifically the 9th edition. According to these guidelines, you should use 1-inch margins on all sides and a readable 12-point font like Times New Roman. The text should be double-spaced throughout. On the first page, your name, your instructor's name, the course, and the date go in the top left corner. The title should be centered with no bold, underline, or italics. Also, there's a header on each page with your last name and the page number. In-text citations follow this pattern. Author's last name and the page number in parentheses. For example, Shakespeare 23. The works cited page comes at the end. It should be alphabetized, titled at the top, and each entry should use hanging indents with complete publication details. There were also a few questions on Latin abbreviations often used in research citations, like ante means before and is used to refer to something mentioned earlier. Et al is short for et ali, meaning and others. It's used when a work has multiple authors. Ibid comes from ibidem, meaning in the same place. It repeats the same source as the one cited just above. Pasim means throughout, used when a topic appears across many parts of a text. And id stands for idem, which means the same author. It refers to the same writer already cited just before. Now let's see what kind of questions we found in the world literature section so far. One topic that came up was the American dream. This is the idea that anyone, no matter their background, can achieve success, freedom, and upward mobility through hard work and determination. It's rooted in the United States Declaration of Independence, which promises life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. While this dream symbolizes hope and opportunity, many literary works have also critiqued it for being unequal or ultimately unattainable. There was a question on Edward Albee, one of the most influential American playwrights. He's known for his intense psychological dramas that explore themes like marital conflict, existential fear, and the illusions people live by. Albee is often associated with the theater of the absurd and is considered a major voice in modern American drama. Another major figure featured was Arthur Miller. Born in 1915 in New York City to a middle-class Jewish family, Miller's writing was shaped by the hardships of the Great Depression. He studied journalism and English at the University of Michigan and rose to fame with All My Sons in 1947. His most iconic play, Death of a Salesman, came out in 1949 and won the Pulitzer Prize. In 1956, he married actress Marilyn Monroe, though the marriage ended 5 years later. That same year, he stood before the House Un-American Activities Committee and refused to name names, an act that led to a contempt of Congress charge, later overturned. His other major works include The Crucible and A View from the Bridge, both powerful critiques of injustice and moral failure. He passed away in 2005, remembered as one of America's greatest playwrights. Then we had Henry James, born in New York City in 1843. He came from a wealthy and intellectual family and was the younger brother of philosopher William James. He spent much of his youth between America and Europe and eventually settled in Europe permanently by the 1870s. His major novels include The Portrait of a Lady, The Wings of the Dove, and The Ambassadors. These novels are known for their psychological insight, social depth, and the tension between American innocence and European complexity. James became a British citizen in 1915, a year before his death. His introspective style and focus on inner character development place him at the heart of literary realism and early modernism. There was also a question on South African literature. While Olive Schreiner is widely celebrated for her novel The Story of an African Farm, published in 1883, the title Father of South African Literature is more traditionally given to Thomas Pringle. He was known for his abolitionist writing, early English poetry, and contributions to colonial literary development in the 19th century. And from Australia, the exam mentioned Patrick White, the first Australian to win the Nobel Prize in Literature, which he received in 1973. His works like Voss and The Tree of Man are deeply spiritual and rooted in the harshness of the Australian landscape. Other key voices include David Malouf, Peter Carey, and Thomas Keneally, who all explored history, post-colonial identity, and myth. Foundational authors like Christina Stead, Henry Lawson, Banjo Patterson, Judith Wright, and Miles Franklin helped shape Australia's literary identity. And importantly, Aboriginal Australian writers such as Oodgeroo Noonukkal, Jack Davis, Lionel Fogarty, and Anita Heiss brought Indigenous voices, oral traditions, and cultural resistance into the centre of Australian literature, focusing on land, identity, and survival. And now we come to the final section. Reading Comprehension. As usual, there were 5 questions, each based on short prose or poetic passages. One of the passages was from a speech by Maya Angelou, adapted from Measure for Measure. The text likely combined poetic expression with moral reflection, focusing on themes like justice, compassion, and human dignity. The questions asked were centered around tone, theme, and the rhetorical devices used in the speech. The second passage was a prose extract discussing poets, painters, and artists. This piece reflected on the creative process, drawing connections between different art forms and how they shape perception and meaning. The questions that followed were likely based on identifying main ideas, tone, and the way artistic imagery was used in the passage. As always, this section tested your ability to read carefully, interpret ideas, and respond with critical understanding. So these are the topics we've been able to collect so far. Personally, I feel that around 70% of the topics were clearly from the syllabus. But when you look around on other YouTube channels, people are calling this one of the toughest exams so far. From our own students' point of view, though, the exam felt moderate. Not extremely easy like before, but definitely manageable and answerable with solid preparation. Now, based on the comments I've been reading from students across platforms, many found the paper really tough. But honestly, it's still too early to make a final judgment. We need to get hold of the actual question paper, solve it in detail, and then decide whether the exam was truly difficult. As for the cutoff, if the paper turns out to be as tough as it seems, you can expect the cutoff for the general category to fall somewhere between 170 and 180. Let me know in the comment box how you found the June 2025 UGC NET English exam. And for more updates, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon so you don't miss anything. Thank you for joining in. I'll see you in our next detailed analysis.